Okay, now for our interview with Garret Graff. I started by asking Graff whether he thinks people have already forgotten the lessons of 9/11.
Well, so I think that there are a couple of things at play there. I mean, the first is simply, a quarter of the U.S. population today was either born after 9/11 or was too young to have any memories of that day. I mean, and that is, something that we are beginning to see in our world in a big way. Last year was the first year that you saw servicemen and women being deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan to fight in a war that was older than they are. Last year it was the first time that new recruits to the New York Fire Department were old enough or young enough, I guess is the right way, to have been born after 9/11. And this fall you will see a college class entering across the country that is almost entirely made up of people born after 9/11. And so I think there is a very real question of how you tell the story of 9/11 and sort of remind people about what happened that day as we move to a generation that will live their entire lives in the world created by 9/11, but will have no actual emotional connection to the underlying events.
Yeah, and there's really a question of what are the lessons of 9/11, because it certainly appears that in many ways we overreacted to 9/11. So, on the one hand, I just made the point that we need to never forget what happened, certainly because of the victims and the first responders and so on, and to be vigilant and recognize that there is this Muslim extremist terrorism out there and a terror network to be concerned about. But when you look at how we responded, it appears that in many ways, as far as wars go, and perhaps even as far as domestic security has gone, the militarization of our police, et cetera, that we perhaps overreacted. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think when you talk to counterterrorism experts, what they all say is, Al Qaeda was more dangerous than we thought it was on September 10th, and not as dangerous as we thought it was on September 12th. And that that the sort of scale of our response was probably not necessary. But, and I think this was sort of an important part of the work that I wanted to do with this book and telling this history, is when you look at the facts of 9/11, it makes it very hard to understand the reaction that we had as a country, as a government, as a military, because it just seems so vastly out of scale. And so what you have to sort of recapture of 9/11, of the experience of 9/11, was the fear of what came next. That it was the fear of what could come that drove so much of the U.S. decision making, on September 12th through that fall of 2001, through the invasion of Iraq.
Yeah, it really was a brilliant, hating to use that word, but a brilliant terrorist attack, both in what they were able to do that day and the fear that they were able to instill. Because at the end of the day, when you look at what happened, I believe we're going with the official narrative. There's conspiracy theories out there, and we'll touch on a little bit of that. But based on the official narrative that happened, it really wasn't an extraordinarily difficult thing to pull off in retrospect, considering the state of our security and our readiness, obviously, at that time. You had to get these guys trained, they had to hijack them, and they had to fly them into these buildings, and that created mass chaos, mass carnage, and mass, ultimately, fear, exactly what they wanted to achieve.
Yeah, and I think that you're right that it was a very specific terror plot that played on vulnerabilities and expectations that we as a society and as a government and as institutions had up until that day. You know, part of, again, retelling that history of 9/11, remembering what happened that day that seems so foreign to us, is the extent to which, uh, you know, things like the hijackers were allowed to carry knives aboard the planes that day. You know, that the military's first response, that air traffic control's response, was not necessarily to intercept the planes once they were hijacked, but to, you know, give the hijackers what they wanted. You know, we had a long history of airplane hijackings in the United States. Never had a plane actually been used as a missile until that day. And so the sort of protocols and the response scenarios that we had in place that day just did not account for what the terrorists were going to do. And I think, you know, when I did the book, when I sort of traced that day as it unfolded, I think you see that innocence of America in those first 17 minutes, the time between the first attack and the second attack. 8:46, the first attack, to 9:03, the second attack into the South Tower. And what you see that day is that during those 17 minutes, sort of America collectively looked at that first attack and shrugged and said, you know, it's got to be a small plane. The pilot was having a heart attack. There was a mechanical problem. Air traffic control is having a really bad day. But our minds collectively did not leap to terrorism. And that President Bush got on the phone with Condi Rice, his national security advisor, and sort of both had a conversation. That was weird. And then they went on with their day. Brian Gunderson, the chief of staff to the House Majority Leader, talks about walking into his House office that morning, seeing the TV on in the reception room. And he said that he thought it was going to be like a bad school shooting, sort of the type of thing that dominates national news, but doesn't actually affect people far from the incident itself. But that even people in New York were not, they were sort of puzzled and horrified by the attack, but went on about their day. You know, one of the most striking quotes I came to in the course of my book research was the story that Peter Johansson told. He was one of the New York waterway ferry captains that morning of 9/11, and he talks about watching that first plane hit the North Tower as his ferry was coming across New York Harbor, and that they pulled into Wall Street Terminal, you know, just a couple of blocks from the World Trade Center, and every single commuter on the boat gets off and walks into Lower Manhattan. And they literally walk off the boat through falling paper and debris from that first tower, but that there was no one on the ferry who said, you know, this just sort of seems like it's going to be a weird day. I think I should go work from home for the rest of the day. You know, America reacted to that first attack thinking it was just something weird that had happened. And it was not until that second attack at 9:03 that we began to realize we were under attack.
What was the intelligence prior to 9/11 about the potential of hijackers flying planes into significant targets?
So it's a complicated question, because the idea that such a plot was possible had certainly been discussed and uh, and plotted, and there had actually even been response scenarios at places like the Pentagon to what might happen if a plane was flown into the building. You know, this was not a totally out of the blue idea. I mean, it had literally been, you know, part of the plot of a Tom Clancy novel before then, where a disgruntled pilot flew a plane into the U.S. Capitol in the midst of a presidential State of the Union style address. And, you know, that is how Jack Ryan, in one of the Tom Clancy books, becomes president of the United States.
Not to mention, by the way, that Al Qaeda is known for suicide bombings.
Yes, Al Qaeda was known for suicide attacks and had plotted large-scale attacks against planes before. There had been something that Al Qaeda had uh, aimed again to sort of hijack and explode airliners in the late 1990s, known as the Bojinka plot.
So how do you explain then the reaction of the people at the helm that day that these hijackings were not likely to result in them flying into buildings, that they were going to be more of a traditional hijacking for money or extortion?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things is, in those initial minutes, there was not clarity that it was an Al Qaeda plot. Hijackings have a long history inside the United States. I mean, we sort of forget now that actually hijackings were quite common in the 1960s and 1970s. I mean, in the 1970s, early 1970s, you had a hijacking almost every week of a commercial airliner inside the United States. So this is something that we have a lot of history with. That the air traffic controllers that day had worked hijackings before, and that they had all ended peacefully, and that they all had ended with the aircraft intact on the ground at an airport. And so, this was a scenario that really just overwhelmed the response and unfolded more quickly than anything that people could sort of get their heads around.
So, with hindsight, there should have been more education and awareness of this possibility of the people that were working in the various positions, the first responders from an air traffic standpoint.
Potentially, but I'm not actually sure that this was sort of a systemic failure of imagination. That morning we didn't have armed aircraft on the ground across the country that would have been able to intercept them for the most part. In the entire country, there were only 8 alert aircraft sitting armed on tarmacs around the country. Two in Massachusetts, 2 in the Pacific Northwest, 2 in the southern United States that did drug interdiction, and 2 at Langley Air Force Base in outside of Washington. And so, that is obviously one thing that has dramatically changed. But that those fighters that day were primarily geared towards intercepting, still in 2001, geared towards intercepting incoming Russian aircraft. The Langley aircraft in Virginia, when they were scrambled off the ground on the morning of 9/11, they weren't initially told what they were responding to, and so they took off as per their prior protocols and flew out towards the Atlantic, looking to intercept an incoming plane before they were told actually that the threat was already over the Capitol.
Let's talk about what the original plan of the terrorist was. First of all, there was 20 hijackers, but only 19 showed up, right?
Yes. So it's a little bit complicated. I'm not sure we sort of still fully understand. The 20th hijacker was turned away by immigration authorities when he tried to enter the United States in the summer of 2001. I think it was down in Florida, if I remember correctly, that he was turned away. And then you had the role of Zacarias Moussaoui in Minnesota, who was one of the only people that's ever been convicted of being a co-conspirator of 9/11.
See, I sort of assumed that was the so-called 20th hijacker. No?
No. The original 20th hijacker was turned away, if I remember correctly, and that Moussaoui was something of a backup hijacker.
And why didn't he participate that day?
He was already under arrest. He had already been caught by the FBI.
Gotcha. So on the day of, they weren't expecting a 20th guy. It was 5 guys for 3 of the planes, 4 for the other one. Yep. And what is your understanding as to what their objective was? In other words, if everything went exactly to their plan, what did they want to do?
Uh, so effectively, they carried out, three of their four attacks completely successfully. As far as we know, the two planes that struck the World Trade Center were intended to go there, and the plane that hit the Pentagon was intended to go to the Pentagon. There is still an open question, and I don't know whether we will ever know for absolute sure now where the ultimate destination of United Flight 93 was supposed to be before the hijackers crashed it after the passengers fought back in the skies over Pennsylvania. The speculation is that it would have been aimed for either the White House or the Capitol, although the sort of opinions are split on which of those was the most likely target. My personal opinion, and it is not informed by any knowledge not available to others, is that it was likely headed to the Capitol, which is a much larger and easier target to hit from the air at 500 miles an hour. The White House is pretty hemmed in by other buildings and would have only been approachable from a single angle, whereas you could have come at the Capitol from any number of angles.
Some people point out that this would take highly skilled pilots in order to guide it directly into the Pentagon or into the Twin Towers, for that matter. What do you know about how skilled these guys were and what level of skill it would require to pull off what they did?
So certainly they were skilled enough to do what they did. I'm not a pilot, so I can't speak to the level of complexity of their attack but obviously they had the training sufficient to pull off what they did.
Mm-hmm. What kind of, in retrospect, is the one thing that you think could have been done to prevent this? As you could, I mean, in reading your book and thinking about it, also watching the movie last night, one thing that comes to my mind is that it did take them a while to decide to ground all planes. I believe that the second plane had already hit the World Trade Center while United 93 is still on the ground. It didn't take off until a few minutes after that second one hit the tower. You would have thought that when the second one hits, there should have been orders to ground all planes.
So I think that the biggest missed opportunity of the attack was actually over the course of that summer, where you had a failure of communication between the CIA and the FBI. And the CIA was aware that two of the hijackers, although obviously they didn't know that they were hijackers, they just knew that they were suspects linked to Al-Qaeda, Khalid al-Midhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, were inside the United States that summer. And that was information that the CIA failed to tell the FBI. And that, to me, is the thing that sort of most clearly, had that information been communicated to the FBI, could have altered the trajectory of the attacks of 9/11. I think we misunderstand a little bit what interdicting the 9/11 plot would have meant. I think there's sort of this idea in the popular imagination that stopping the 9/11 plot, would have been, SWAT teams kicking in, 19 doors on the morning of September 10th and arresting all of the hijackers, and everything goes on about their day. I think the much more likely scenario of what would have happened if we had been able to successfully disrupt that plot is that we wouldn't have necessarily ever known that the 9/11 plot was underway. That sort of what we could have done was, take a couple of these terrorists off the board, and we might not have ever actually understood what the plot was that they had been doing and aiming for, And they might very well have carried out the plot at a later date. That those security vulnerabilities might well have persisted and allowed them to reconstitute and do the attack, let's say in 2002, which is effectively exactly what you saw happen with the bombing of the USS Cole. The original Al Qaeda plot had been to attack the USS Fitzgerald's in 2000 as part of the Millennium Plot, and blow up the USS Fitzgerald's during a port visit there months and months earlier. But the skiff that Al Qaeda had loaded the bomb onto was overloaded and it sank. And the USS Fitzgerald's went on without ever realizing it had been the target of a bomb plot, and we had no idea that this plot was underway until Al Qaeda sort of reconstituted itself and successfully attacked the Cole later in 2000.
So you're saying there theoretically could have been a temporary disruption because FBI could have detained a few of these hijackers that were in the middle of their training.
Effectively, yes. We might have been able to sort of disrupt this plot at the training stage or the planning stage, without ever necessarily understanding what we were disrupting.
Does that give air to conspiracy theorists who say that, U.S. knew this was going to happen and allowed it to happen?
No, and I say that for sort of a variety of reasons. One of which is, it was actually a very complicated situation that was unfolding between the FBI and the CIA in the spring and summer of 2001. The CIA did not necessarily have great reasons, but they had reasons for why they didn't share the information that they should have shared with the FBI. There were some legal structures in place at the time that the CIA thought it made difficult in order to share intelligence directly with the FBI. And then sort of just more broadly, I put very, very little weight on conspiracy theories involving the U.S. government because as someone who has covered the U.S. government and intelligence and national security and federal law enforcement for 15 years, conspiracy theories presuppose a level of competence that is not necessarily on display in the day-to-day activities of the U.S. government. That makes it very hard for me to imagine that you would ever be able to carry out a conspiracy theory successfully and then keep it quiet for as long as it would need to be kept quiet.
Well, we think along the same lines when it comes to that. It's impossible to overestimate government incompetence. We've been covering the Jeffrey Epstein death, and there's another example of prison incompetence leading to a death as opposed to a conspiracy, which many people believe in.
I think you're absolutely right, and and I think that bears true for the sort of full range of the 9/11 conspiracy theories. Whether you are talking about the U.S. government having foreknowledge, or the idea that has been sort of debunked time and again that the Twin Towers were brought down by internal demolition.
Well, let's cover that one real quick because I did want to talk about the towers. First of all, how many towers were there? It wasn't like 7 or 8?
So the World Trade Center complex involved, a number of buildings, sort of many more than we sort of typically think of. You had the two main towers, World Trade Center 1, World Trade Center 2. You had the Marriott Hotel, which was sandwiched between them, 48-story Marriott Hotel. And then you had other World Trade Center buildings that were part of that complex, Building 3, Building 4, Building 5,
right,
up to Building 7.
So a total of 7. And did all 7 come down?
No. All of them involved serious damage. The Marriott hotel was effectively completely destroyed. And then you had the sort of second largest tower collapse at the end of the day after a day of sort of unsustained or completely sustained uncombated fire.
Tower 7 you're talking about.
Yep.
Sticking with the Marriott, because I really had lost, I had forgotten about the Marriott till I read your book. So, did people die inside the Marriott?
Yes, and the Marriott was, it was a 48-story building that basically bore the brunt of both Tower 1 and Tower 2 falling on top of it. And so there were some people who survived who were inside of it, and my book follows some of them, but there were certainly many casualties in and around the Marriott hotel.
It was being evacuated, I presume, but whoever didn't evacuate.
Yes, and then you did have first responders who were inside the building for the evacuation who ended up losing their lives as the towers fell as well.
Interestingly, in your book, correct me if I'm wrong, in the South Tower, the North Tower is the first one to go down, first one to be hit, right, and go down.
The North Tower was the first to be hit. The South Tower was the first to come down.
Oh, okay, I had forgotten that. But after the North Tower was hit, specifically there was announcements in the South Tower, we're fine, do not evacuate.
Yes, and that's another one of those moments that sort of really makes clear just how different the American psyche was on that day. That people sort of literally sat at their desks in Tower 2, watched that first crash into the North Tower from their desks, and then remained at their desks. And some of them began to evacuate. The Port Authority came on the building-wide public announcement system and turned around and said, the incident has been contained to the North Tower. Please feel free to return to your desks.
Yeah, incredible. So there's experts on both sides of this, I believe, but tell me what you know about the experts saying that, yes, a 747 can cause one of these towers to collapse. You do not need additional explosives for that.
Yes, and I think that has been sort of very well proven over the course of the engineering reports done by NIST and others about this incident. But what you basically had was it was less the impact of the planes and more the burning jet fuel that melted the metal that literally held up the World Trade Center. And so from there, once that metal was softened and melted, the building basically began to collapse on itself.
But there are experts to the contrary who say, no, it's not possible?
There are no experts who are respected on the other side. There is no plausible explanation for the buildings coming down other than the crash of the plane.
And what about Tower 7? What's the explanation for how that went down, even though it wasn't impacted directly by a plane?
So it was impacted by the falling debris and
because it's much lower,
rampaging fires.
Yeah, so it's the towers are 110 stories approximately, whereas Tower 7 was.
It was in the I forget the exact number, but it was in
half the size,
30-ish story building.
So theoretically, debris from the Twin Towers is falling on top of that.
Correct.
And ultimately, the weight of that brings it down, or were there fires that happened inside?
Yeah. So basically, what ends up happening over the course of that day is that those fires, the fires that start from the debris, that start from the fires coming down from Tower 1 and Tower 2, burn unrestricted and through the course of that entire day. And the FDNY, the New York Fire Department, they made a conscious decision to not fight that fire, both because of the risk to their personnel, but then also due to the overwhelming disaster that had already befallen the city with the collapse of Tower 1 and Tower 2. That they didn't want to. They'd already lost 343 firefighters that day and didn't want to lose any more.
Is that ultimately the total number that were lost?
Of the firefighters, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And then there were about 100 other first responders who were killed. Port Authority Police, New York City Police, NYPD, Secret Service, FBI, fire marshals, other personnel like that.
Yeah, and the hero was of so many of them that probably knew they were not going to survive and still went into that building.
Yeah, and I quote some of the FDNY leaders, the ones who survived that day, talking about that decision and sort of the bravery of the firefighters who were going up even as people were coming down. And they talked about sort of how what their rescue personnel did was they provided hope to those who were trapped. I mean, remember there were about 1,100 people who survived the attack, but were trapped above the impact zone, and that most of them did not realize that their lives were ultimately at risk. That that the towers would fall, and so the New York firefighters who were heading up to save them, thought that they had an opportunity to actually rescue them.
Do we know whether bin Laden himself expected the towers to fall?
I think that the consensus is that that Al-Qaeda did not understand that the buildings would come down. They certainly understood that by choosing long-distance transcontinental flights, they were maximizing the explosive capabilities of the planes that they were hijacking, but that they were not, they were not necessarily gambling on the towers coming down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, even experts probably, if you had consulted them, may not have necessarily known that until it actually happens.
Correct. And, for much of the initial response there, the fire department's expectation was that sort of basically the buildings would be a loss above the impact, that they wouldn't necessarily be able to put the fires out, but that the fires would sort of burn their way to the top and destroy the tops of the World Trade Center. But, it was not until late in the 9 a.m. hour that morning that the New York Fire Department really began to understand that the buildings themselves could come down.
Yeah, and that adds to the chaos on the street because first everybody thinks it's a small plane, even when there's a second plane, and even perhaps when people realized that they were jets that had flown into them. To your point, nobody's expecting these buildings to come down. Did they? But I guess they were evacuating the area, though, or were people just leaving on their own?
Both. I mean, they were very actively evacuating the buildings, even below the impact zones.
But how about the area around the buildings?
And then evacuating the buildings and other areas around them, including the Marriott Hotel.
So a friend of mine who would have been a great interview for your book, even though you have plenty of them, you didn't need more. But I just vividly remember his story because he was working a few blocks away from it, and to just talk about the chaos. And on the one hand, everybody underestimated the attack at the outset, as you point out. Nobody's thinking terror; they're thinking some idiot flew a small plane into the building. But then it ended up being people ultimately stating what they thought it was, that basically New York was under attack, that this was war, and it wasn't just two planes that had flown in. There was additional attacks because they're hearing one explosion after another. There's one plane that hits, there's another plane, there's a tower that goes down, there's another tower that goes down, there's a third tower that goes down, and the absolute utter chaos and fear that was going on for people who were in Manhattan at the time that just assumed that we were under some type of major military attack.
Yes, and you sort of see that in all sorts of places over the course of the day. I mean, there was fear when the first fighter planes got over New York City. I quote people in the book talking about how they didn't necessarily think that those fighter planes belonged to us. That it was part of an ongoing attack. One of the most confusing aspects of the day after the towers collapse for the first responders at what we now call Ground Zero, the World Trade Center site, is the Secret Service field office that was in the World Trade Center. In their vault, they had a huge stockpile of ammunition, and the ammunition began to cook off as the fires spread. And so, the police and first responders at Ground Zero are hearing gunshots go off. And they think that they're now under land assault from the terrorists who are sort of sweeping in after the crashes from the ground. I quote sort of a number of different first responders who sort of all hear these gunshots going off and think that they are under some sort of ground attack.
Yeah, we also covered the Las Vegas shooting in a lot of detail, and it reminds me of that situation. As it turns out, conventional thinking is it was one guy by himself reigning this incredible chaos below. If you speak to the people who were at that concert, 9 out of 10 will say no way was it one shooter, that it was multiple shooters coming from multiple directions, from the ground, this and that, because when you're in that chaotic situation, the sound of the bullets are echoing off of the buildings in Vegas and so on, and to them, it was a multifaceted terrorist attack.
Yep. And you see that, by the way, on much smaller scales also. I mean, many mass shootings, the first reports is for multiple gunmen, and it, almost always turns out to have just been a single shooter.
One of the tougher chapters of your book involves the people who jumped. How many people do we think actually had jumped to their death out of the buildings?
I don't know that we have a real solid number. It's certainly in the dozens, and there's also some. It's important to understand some people fell, some people jumped by choice, and we don't know, what the division between those two categories necessarily is. But in the neighborhood of a few dozen, perhaps 100.
Wow. And they were just in a circumstance where the flames had reached them and it was either burn to death or jump.
Yes. I mean, it is incredible to imagine what the circumstances must have been like for those people who did make a conscious decision to jump, to imagine that sort of what lay ahead of them was better than what lay behind them.
And I was listening to this part of your book, so correct me if I have it wrong, but I thought what I heard is that one of the jumpers or someone who fell actually landed on and killed a fireman.
Yeah, actually, sort of the sort of widely accepted first casualty of the New York City firefighters that day was a firefighter named Danny Schur, who was hit by someone falling or jumping from the tower on the plaza outside the World Trade Center.
Incredible. The orders to shoot down the plane. There's been there's a lot written and talked about those orders. Ultimately, well, walk me through it a little bit, because they weren't able to get a hold of the president, so they were wanting to get the vice president to order that it's okay to shoot. Ultimately, I think the president does approve it. Then there's some controversy as to whether that order was ever actually given, because I know there was some fear that they might accidentally shoot down a plane that they thought had been hijacked when it was not. So kind of walk us through that timeline.
Yeah, so there's sort of a couple of different points of confusion around this. One is when the first order to shoot down hijacked airliners comes in, and whether Vice President Cheney gave the order himself or whether he had spoken to President Bush before he passed along the order at the White House.
And by the way, there's an interesting issue even before you get to that, which is who can give such an order. At some point, a decision, I assume this isn't written anywhere, or maybe it is protocol for this. I guess that would be a question. Is there protocol for who makes that decision? Is it necessarily have to come from the commander-in-chief, or why is a general not sufficient?
Yeah, and I think the short answer is now there are much more finely tuned protocols. But on 9/11, no one wanted to be the person making that decision short of the president himself. And so what you see that morning is sort of a series of confusing remarks or confusing conversations that take place mostly between 10:12 a.m. and 10:18 a.m., where Vice President Cheney appears to give the order to the Pentagon to shoot down further hijacked airliners. And what, to the best of the recollection of the 9/11 Commission, he and President Bush don't actually speak until closer to 10:20. And so it does seem like Vice President Cheney gave that first order unilaterally without speaking to the president. Now, when he and the president did speak, the president clearly okayed that order. So Vice President Cheney has long maintained that he spoke to the president and then passed along the order to the Pentagon. But that is not backed up by the evidence that we have available to us. Now, of course, it sort of ends up being somewhat moot because what we now understand, which they did not understand at the time, was that fully the last plane, Flight 93, United Airlines Flight 93, had crashed at 10:03 that morning, and there were no further hijacked airliners in the air that morning.
And that clarifies a conspiracy point of the people who believe that plane was shot down, that the orders that it was approved to shoot down a plane did not come until that plane had already crashed.
Yes, and it's backed up by the fact that there were no fighter jets anywhere close to United Flight 93 by the time it went down. And that actually Cheney's order does get transmitted out to fighter jets, notably two at Andrews Air Force Base, piloted by Heather Lucky Penny and Mark Sassville of the DC Air National Guard. But those planes aren't actually even airborne until about 10:30.
It is a really, really incredible order, though, when you really just stop and think about it, and just demonstrates how crazy that day was, that the U.S. military was authorized to kill Americans.
Yes, and that there was actually very little hesitancy on the part of either President Bush or Vice President Cheney to give that order. That the thinking was, we have to take lives in the sky in order to save lives on the ground. But that over the course of that morning, what you saw was sort of the people who were with President Bush aboard Air Force One when he was having that conversation with Dick Cheney. He hangs up that telephone, and remember, he was a National Guard pilot himself, and so he turned to his aides around him and said, I was a pilot. I can't imagine getting the order that I just gave.
What that tells me is that at that time, there was no technology such that we could take over the controls of those planes, that the only option was to shoot them down.
Correct. I don't think that technology exists today.
Yeah, it would be. I mean, technologically, it's probably possible. Whether it's been implemented, right? It certainly, we have drone planes, so these would be drone jets. But it would seem to me, I'm just totally kind of spitballing here, but that theoretically you could have these planes outfitted in a way that the controls could be taken over in some type of an emergency situation like this.
It would certainly be technically possible. I think that one of the reasons that it has not happened already is the obvious cyber vulnerabilities that would open up. A nefarious actor could also then attempt to gain control of the airplane by that point.
Why is it that Cheney was not able to speak to Bush for such an extended period?
Well, so this was a major part of the story of 9/11 is the technological limitations that the government was operating on over the course of that day. This was 2001. It sort of feels like modern times, but technologically it was still the Stone Age. Air Force One did not have satellite television capabilities at that point. It was still primarily relying on effectively rabbit-eared TV antennas to pick up TV channels at the time. And then during that 1010 to 1020 window, they were just out of touch with the land.
Mm-hmm. Now, things that we've implemented since 9/11 to bolster security. The one everybody sees is when they're at the airport and what you now have to go through at the airport. First, let's touch on that because, like you said, it was recent times, but it was long ago times. What was in place as far as airport security to get on a plane pre-9/11, and what was implemented post-9/11?
Yeah, so before 9/11, remember, it was mostly private security. These were not government employees. These were not government guards. And the range of what you could bring on board was much wider. I mean, small knives were, in fact, explicitly allowed on planes at the time. And obviously that changed after 9/11. The Transportation Security Administration was created to sort of federalize airport security and transportation security across the country. And then after the 2004 Al-Qaeda plot against the London planes was when liquids were banned from coming on board planes. And again, that's sort of one of those things we mostly take for granted today. But, I remember flying when I was in college and, you saw people bringing, 20 packs of beer on the plane in their carry-ons.
Yeah, and sorry, I lost my train of thought on. An observation that I have is that the cabin for the cockpit for the pilots is still not particularly secure. The old roll the drink cart in front of the cockpit trick doesn't seem to be like airtight security. And if you could somehow genuinely secure that cockpit, then a lot of the other security becomes far less important. So it just surprises me that we don't keep that cockpit absolutely buttoned down to 100% locked. Perhaps even, now this would take somewhat of a redesign of planes, but have the pilots enter the cockpit not through the main cabin. They have their own external door that gets them into the cockpit, and then that is locked, and that's it. They're off, and they're not coming back. There is no way to get into the cockpit from the cabin.
Yes, that could potentially help. It is, though, almost 19 years later, and we've never seen a plot similar like this. And that's partly because of the changes made with TSA and the armored cockpit doors, such that they have been upgraded already. But then it's also, look at United Flight 93, which even by the end of that morning, passengers had reacted and the crew had reacted in real time to interdict and disrupt the plot of the hijackers who took over United Flight 93. And so, I think one of the reasons you have not seen Al Qaeda sort of pursue this plot further is the recognition that, any attempt to take over a plane today would be not met with docile passengers and crew.
Yeah, well, I really, really hate saying this, but it concerns me a little bit because it seems like, like I said, we overreact and then we underreact. It's a constant pendulum going back and forth. But I think there's been lots of examples of things when they've tested current TSA security of it not being as good as we'd hope it would. So we all stand in these long, annoying lines, but turns out there are a number of things that can be snuck through there. It isn't hard to manufacture a weapon, right? They manufactured them right on the plane on that United 93. And when that cockpit door is open and all it is a female flight attendant standing in front of a juice cart, that someone could jump into that situation and hop in that cockpit pretty easily, close and lock the door, and they're now in control.
Yes, but again, sort of, we haven't seen that, and there are a lot of steps sort of prior to that that have been implemented through intelligence and law enforcement means that would, they hope, interdict and disrupt a plot like that sort of far upstream as well. The ability to carry out a highly coordinated attack in the way that Al Qaeda did sort of the 9/11 plot as centrally planned and executed as it was, we're much better attuned to the indicators of a plot like that today.
What do you know about the, I think they call them U.S. air marshals that fly on the planes? That was something else that was implemented. Is that still going on? And do we know to what extent, what percentage of planes have some type of a undercover U.S. marshal on it?
So before 9/11, this was a long-standing operation. The air marshals had long existed, going back into the 1960s and 70s. There were a very small number left on 9/11, and it was ramped up very quickly after 9/11 and has sort of largely proven, arguably ineffective. The percentage of flights that are covered by air marshals remains very low. The air marshals have never seriously interdicted a plot as it was unfolding. But it's hard to know sort of what deterrent effect. Backers of the program would tell you it's hard to know what deterrent effect the program has.
Mm-hmm. But if you're talking about a cross-country flight, L.A. to New York, 50% chance there's one on there?
So the technical numbers of the air marshals is classified. The technical percentage of flights that is covered is classified. But I would guess that on an average day, absent any other specific threat intelligence, the chances of encountering an air marshal are effectively zero.
What had bin Laden planned as an encore to this, as far as we know?
I don't know that we have a good sense of what a follow-on plot might have been. What we do know is that there was sort of another major plot in the fall of 2004. The planes plot in London that brought, where Al Qaeda sort of hoped to down something like a dozen transatlantic airliners all at once.
Wow, I'd forgotten that story. How were they going to down them?
So that's the plot that leads to the ban on liquids aboard planes, and effectively sort of oversimplifying, they were going to bring on harmless liquids that, when mixed together aboard the plane, formed an explosive.
And considering the timing of what's going on in Afghanistan right now, it's a very good time to ask this question. Do you buy into the theory that bin Laden's objective in that terrorist attack on 9/11 was to draw the U.S. into a war in Afghanistan?
So it's very clear that bin Laden's had been, through the 1990s, sort of raising the stakes of his attacks, trying to get the U.S. to pay attention and trying to provoke precisely the type of response that we ended up unfolding after 9/11.
So to that extent, we played right into his hands.
We responded in precisely the way that he anticipated.
And he hearkened back to the war with the Soviets, and the Soviets were ultimately defeated, and that was their primary enemy at that time. Now their primary enemy had become the U.S. for a variety of reasons, I guess. But so the idea was to have some great victory in Afghanistan against the United States?
Well, his goal was, it was not Afghanistan specific. It was to provoke the United States into a war against Islam and a war against Muslims, and to sort of push the U.S. Remember, sort of his original complaint was the basing of U.S. soldiers in the Holy Land in Saudi Arabia around the Muslim holy sites of Mecca and Medina.
So, hindsight being 2020, what should the U.S.'s reaction have been in the Middle East? What action should we take? I mean, clearly you can't let Al Qaeda continue as it was after 9/11. So, what should we have done?
I think it's a very complicated question, and I don't know that I have a simple answer for it. I think the clearest, as long as we're playing the hindsight is 2020 game, I think the clearest way would have been to have taken bin Laden more seriously prior to 9/11, and to have responded more forcefully to, for instance, the Kenya and Tanzanian embassy bombings in 1998. Where, remember, that sort of unfolded in the midst of the Clinton impeachment debacle with Monica Lewinsky, and Clinton fired off cruise missiles aimed at targeting bin Laden, and was criticized as sort of a wag the dog phenomenon of attempting to distract from his impeachment problems.
But here's kind of a crazy thought, but by going to Afghanistan, didn't that have the effect of reducing the terror threat in the U.S. in two ways? One, obviously, it distracted Al Qaeda, but two, we did what bin Laden sought out to achieve: drag the U.S. into a war in the Middle East. So he had already served his purpose. He didn't need new terrorist acts.
No, he remained ambitious about carrying on further attacks, right through, the last one that we know of, was circa 2009, 2010, I forget which exact year, with Najibullah Azazi's attempt to bomb the New York City subway. I mean, so he was, long after 9/11, bin Laden was still quite focused on further attacks.
Last thing let's touch on a little bit is just the Saudi connection. First of all, what can you tell us about the story that Saudis that were friends of the Bushes, et cetera, were able to leave the country bin Laden's, in fact, bin Laden's and or Saudis left the U.S. like the day after the attack?
Exactly that happened, which is, there were bin Laden family members inside the United States who were ushered out of the United States aboard private aircraft, in the hours and days after 9/11.
Now, is that because they wanted to be out, or we wanted them out?
So it is not a part of 9/11 that I have dove real deeply into. So beyond the existence of the flight, I don't actually know the reasoning nor the passengers involved.
And aren't I correct that just within the last year, there's been more Saudis deported that we believe may have been terrorists that were in flight schools?
Well, so what you saw was the shooting at the
Right.
Air Force Base by a Saudi flight student that led to the other Saudis who were members of the military in training in the United States being deported as well.
So I hate to chuckle at that, but you have to like be bewildered that after all these Saudis took flight classes in the U.S. and became hijackers and created the worst terror event in U.S. history, that we still have Saudis in the U.S. learning how to fly planes.
The relationship and our ally relationship with Saudi Arabia is manifestly complicated.
And there's no question that the Saudis are well aware of this terror element in their country, have not been able to curtail it. And in fact, in order to keep them at bay and to stay in power, it's believed that they allow it to continue, if not actually fund it.
Correct.
And like you said, complicated relationship.
And I think, again, when you sort of go back to thinking about a new generation of Americans as they learn about 9/11, I think there are a lot of people who now sort of hear the story of 9/11 and wonder, well, why didn't we invade Saudi Arabia?
Yeah.